Welcome everybody to today's live webinar, which is called Most Valuable Retargeting Strategies for Mobile Gaming Apps. My name is Fabian. I'm going to be the host of today's webinar. I work for Adjust in the marketing team. We're live today from Berlin and from London, and we have with us from Aarki, Nicole Checo, who's the director of product there. And we also have from Adjust, Martina Visenya, who's a senior technical account manager, and she's gonna cover the Adjust part in this webinar. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items to make it as easy as possible for you to follow along. So we've slated the presentation for about 30 minutes, so there will be plenty of time for questions. And for those who are new and haven't listened to any of our partner webinars, there's always this GoToWebinar question panel. So you just enter the name of the presenter or the name of the company that you would like to ask, and then we'll make sure to take all those questions at the very end. So yeah, please be active, be proactive, and if you have any questions or doubts about any of the concepts or slides, just be active and post it into the question panel. Also, needless to say, that we'll record the presentation and send it to you guys via email afterwards, so you don't have to take notes. Cool, and yeah, last slide of the intro. So this is the agenda for today. So we'll give you a brief intro and definition of retargeting, especially retargeting for mobile gaming apps, and then some words on strategy, some concepts explained, basically some best practices around the retargeting process. And then at the end of the first part, we'll show you some case studies on the Aarki side. The second part, we'll kick it off with segmentation and basic segments you could create for your app as well that will help you in the retargeting process. We'll show you the Adjust Audience Builder, which is a new tool that we launched not so long ago, but that's already helped countless clients succeed in retargeting. And then at the very end, that's point 7, we will hopefully have enough time to cover all your questions and answer them. That's all I had. Enjoy the presentation, and with that, I would like to pass it on to Nicole.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you attendees for joining us for this webinar. We at Aarki are really excited to join Adjust and talk about how we approach retargeting and how we've built successful retargeting campaigns for our customers. Before we get started, I just want to share a little bit about Aarki. We started in the mobile space in 2010. And we launched Aarki Encore, our integrated platform for programmatic media buying and creative, in 2015. Since then, we've been offering unified optimization of media and creative for mobile app marketers, and we work predominantly across mobile gaming apps, but we have experience working across a variety of different campaigns, from user acquisition to now significant retargeting efforts, as well as cross-promotion. You know, since launching in 2015, we've grown massively. We're a global team now, located around the world in 5 offices. We've integrated with several exchanges, you know, with over 13 exchanges. We're really focused purely on mobile inventory only. And for Aarki, creative is really important. Besides on the programmatic buying side, we started out with a creative background. So to give you an idea of scale of what we do, just in 2017, we've created over 15,000 versions of creatives for our customers to date. I'm excited to see what the end of year numbers are going to look like. So I guess let's dive in. Before we get into the case studies and everything, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And so at Aarki, what we consider retargeting, since we're predominantly focused on the in-app space, is the common thread is driving previous users of an app to become active app users again. Since everything we do is app, it could be, you know, getting users to you know, reactivate in the game, level up, complete new challenges, try new extensions to the game. As well as, you know, what we're seeing retargeting, say, for commerce within an e-commerce app to drive users to complete purchases. But really, the common thread is to just reactivate that user, whether that user has uninstalled the app and driving them to reinstall the app, or if they still have the app available and getting them to reopen and complete whatever the desired outcome is. while, for retargeting, while we have very specific objectives like this, a lot of the KPIs we look at tend to be very similar to user acquisition campaigns. Predominantly, our focus is really around ROI-based campaigns for almost all of our customers. So, as I said about Aarki, we do a lot of different campaign types for our customers, user acquisition, cross promotion, but retargeting is one of them. And when we look at retargeting campaigns, we see 4 distinct pillars that are unique to retargeting campaigns, or leveraged differently for retargeting campaigns versus user acquisition. Probably the most significant of which actually is audiences. Really, any retargeting campaign requires a list of users to target, but not all lists are created equal. One area we're going to expand on in upcoming slides is really talking about how a clear set of audience segments to start with can actually really set up a retargeting campaign for success. Another area with retargeting, when we start thinking about setting up a retargeting campaign that's different from user acquisition, is really maximizing match rate. This in some ways directly related to audiences and also our ability to reach as many possible users. From a campaign perspective, what we'll talk about is this means strategies to maximize our match rate, either leveraging optimizations on our bidder technology, through exchange partners, but also when we think about starting a campaign initiative, really leveraging a much broader supply source and a broader range of creatives than we might necessarily do when we start out with a brand new app user acquisition campaign. And I mentioned creative, so a really important pillar actually for any campaign at Aarki, since we build all creatives in-house, and it's tied with our media buying platform. But for retargeting, particularly, creative strategies are really key in the sense that we can leverage it to increase match rate, but also because we have potential audience, an audience to already retarget, that can start informing creative in and creative strategies in terms of personalization and localization to increase ad engagement that are unique specifically to retargeting campaigns. And finally, last but definitely not least, at Aarki, bidding models are also different for retargeting. We exclusively train our models on retargeting campaigns, on past retargeting campaigns for retargeting campaigns. This is because in our experience that the user who's reactivated, particularly a user who's reactivated and spends after retargeting campaign, we do see differences between them and a typical user acquisition target user. And since our models are very heavily user influenced, we find that actually training on retargeting campaigns really allows us to better optimize our buying. And this is an area in which we're constantly developing and focusing on having further honing the exclusive retargeting model. So how does this all actually work together? At a broad level, it's all about, for retargeting, it's all about training, scaling, and learning. And the really great thing about retargeting is that by starting with audience segments while a lot of this is similar to user acquisition, is actually we can jump to scale much faster, particularly when we partner with people like Adjust and our customers to start with audience lists. Having defined user attributes and strong audience lists actually help train our models faster, getting us to performance faster. Once the training phase, we can actually scale, and with retargeting, we are very aggressive in our supply and creative coverage. And at this point is where we start generating the learnings from the model based on actual performance. Real-time performance is fed back, and this is where the attribution process becomes invaluable in allowing both us as campaign managers to monitor performance, but also to receive additional information that can be used to further hone and train our model. And it really just creates this learning feedback loop. So I actually want to talk a little bit more about the audience segments portion of this. Really, audience and creatives, I think, is going to be the focus for us here today that I want to share a little bit more about. And for us, audience is probably the most important pillar of retargeting. So as I said before, not all audiences are created equal. So from the Aarki perspective, some of our best practices and ideal scenarios is to think about the types of audience segments we received. For example, static audience lists lead to inefficient buys. While we can control for some of it and start creating, dynamic lists, suppressing users we've seen, what we're actually seeing is that for customers who, invest to push dynamic audience segments directly to our platform, are able to run much more efficient campaigns. We can work in a variety of ways, whether it's through direct integrations with our audience API or through partners and integrations like the Adjust Audience Builder. While we recognize that sharing extensive user data is something that advertisers want to share only with select partners, for us we see it as a way. It allows us to be much more effective in buying with these dynamic audience lists. We're not wasting impressions. We're not wasting spend on users who are no longer in your audience criteria. And users' criteria can change at any time. They could have made a purchase and they're no longer in the retargeting list. So with dynamic lists, we're able to efficiently, in near real time, adjust who we bid on and when. Finally, the other thing is think about, you might have an overall retargeting effort to reactivate users, but that doesn't mean you should just be sending one audience segment. You're just general retargeting audience segments. We really do want to push our partners to think about segmenting out your general retargeting group and think about banding potential retargeting users by levels of spend. The other thing is think about what user attributes you can share. Providing audiences banded by spend can be very useful for the modeling, really sort of pre-train the model and get to efficient scale fast. But being able to leverage on user attributes such as engagement history, social connections, time of last activity, those are actually useful features to further enhance the model. And if you have this information, we'll talk about it in some of the case studies that they can actually really improve the performance of retargeting campaigns. And finally, think about providing different goals, KPIs based on your retargeting segments rather than one retargeting group. If you're banding out segments by spend, providing clear goals on the value of each segment will allow a partner like us to optimize the campaign the best way possible. And then finally, we've been very lucky to work with partners that have, enabled us to encourage experimentation. So as I mentioned, think about audience segments, not just in terms of your reactivation users, but as I mentioned, banding with these, allowing us to do intersections or experiments based on other user features of, for gender, age, location, in addition to spend level, because all of those can then start informing other aspects of the retargeting campaign, such as creative. So creative is also something that we look at a little differently for retargeting campaign. The first and foremost, which is really the easiest, is that we really focus on running on as many ad formats as possible. One is it's easy, it maximizes our match rates, but two, we already know the user that we're looking to acquire. So we could be much more aggressive, particularly at the start of an effort in bidding than we would necessarily for user acquisition. When we start, say, a user acquisition campaigns, we progressively test out and identify benchmarks for a campaign and then iterate on creatives. With retargeting, we know who we're targeting. We can be much more aggressive faster with formats and versions of and variations on formats. Finally, with retargeting, we're starting with knowledge about this user. So leveraging dynamic creative, sequential messaging. We can leverage app features that would be more interesting to a retargeting level, such as new features, levels they may not have seen, or special promos. And finally, experimentation with personalization. So this is something that we've been working on a fair amount these last few months, is personalizing creative messaging for retargeting based on our knowledge of that audience, of that user. And initially, what we're starting to see is that there's some interesting trends in terms of sort of install rates and conversion rates with personalized creative. And we're able to do this from a creative perspective at scale because we have the defined audience data. And then finally, localization. Knowing where the user is, we can localize creative in language as well as in-app game content if it's localized as well. So a little bit more about creative, just to showcase actually how it works. So I mentioned that for retargeting, we tend to have a much broader mix of creative to start. And user acquisition, here I'm looking at two campaigns. One is retargeting and one is user acquisition. And the user acquisition campaign is actually a very mature campaign. We've been running it for a while. We've introduced almost all creative formats into the mix. They're running the same mix of creatives, but what we'll actually see is that the types of creatives that perform for retargeting versus user acquisition tend to be actually ended up being very different, with video driving a much larger share of performance. So while the mix of video for retargeting is about 50-50, when we actually look at its return, is that the return on the video for retargeting is far higher than the other ad units combined, whereas where it's actually about 25% higher return on ad spend. Whereas when we're looking at a user acquisition campaign, video is an important part, but it's actually performs about 15% return on ad spend, 15% higher return on ad spend versus other units. So for retargeting, we actually see that different types of creative treatments actually move the needle, and this is why it's important to to actually have our campaign analysts and creative team analyze campaign performance and optimize the creative mix, based on the type of campaign. So I talked a lot about some of our approaches to retargeting in theory, general guidelines that we cover. So I actually want to get into some actual case studies that we've done. So all of these are predominantly for casual games, and these will actually highlight how we've actually taken these pillars and used them successfully in market. So we've just talked about creatives, really. So as I mentioned, retargeting has led to a lot more opportunities for creative experimentation, particularly creative experimentation early on. But here, I want to talk about something a little bit different. So this first case study, we've actually worked on a campaign for a legacy app with a large global user base, and this is key. So our client here is a major games developer, and over the years, they've released several new apps to their portfolio, but they still have, legacy core apps within their portfolio that, while they've been in market for a while, are actually still have very high active monthly users. They're constantly being updated, and they just wanted to drive additional active users of their core older titles. They've had users who they've released a lot of new titles. They've potentially migrated them onto newer apps, different apps, and they want to get them to revisit probably some of the first apps that they've ever experienced within their portfolio. So in this case, we worked. In this case, after some creative experimentation, we actually found that creative messaging in this case was we found using showcasing game characters, play, and boosters was very similar to user acquisition creative. We're essentially reintroducing an existing game to users. But what we actually found here is that because we had all this historical information about users and segmented information about the value different geos and different user segments were driving, we actually were able to hyper-focus on geographies for this campaign. So we really focused on localization, right? And localization sounds like a no-brainer. But localization here wasn't just focusing on your tier 1 markets. We actually, because we had rich audience data, were able to identify that it was valuable to actually localize in nearly 24 different languages. We weren't just localizing English, French, Spanish, Chinese, and Portuguese, Mandarin and Portuguese. We went down. We found that there was opportunity to target Malay, Hindi, Farsi, Thai, Turkish, and this was all due to the rich audience data. And as I said, localization seems like a no-brainer. Actually, at first, what we saw was that From a creative perspective, if you looked at sort of initial funnel metrics, we saw that CTRs were about the same. We started off running non-localized creatives and started testing localization. But what we actually found was that when you looked at conversions, so we were actually able to significantly lower the CPI and really increase the return by localizing the initial creative. So while users were clicking through on the non-localized creatives, users that had the localized creatives were much more likely to then actually reconvert, reinstall, reopen, and re-enter and activate within the game. And as you can see, that had an increase in, that had significantly improved our CPIs, it significantly improved our return, and by identifying these key geos, we were actually able to drive additional volume because we were much more efficient in our spending. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens though when you don't have all this data. I feel like I've been stressing a lot about how important it is to start with rich audience segments, as much data as possible, but we recognize that sometimes that's just not possible. And that doesn't mean that you can't run retargeting campaigns. So while much of our optimization heavy lifting is done by the algorithms, we actually have a very hands-on campaign management. And it takes a variety of forms. Generally, it's not about backlisting and whitelisting. It's a lot about creative testing, testing out new models, which we're constantly in development. So we do a lot of champion challenger, both on creative and model testing, as well as tuning campaigns in terms of targets. And this was something we did for this next customer of ours. They launched a new game relatively recently, and that's the key here, relatively recently. And they want to keep these users who had downloaded and played the game active. Since this was a newer title, we didn't actually have a lot of historical player data to drive the retargeting strategy in terms of what were key geos, key platforms, what geos were, had, the best spend potential. So what we actually did here, we actually launched, and our campaign managers were very hands-on in optimizing the campaign. And what that really meant was actually focusing the campaign, watching the performance by geo, by device, and then tuning the goals for those devices and those geos. And actually this manual process can also be a way to run a successful retargeting campaign. So just because you don't necessarily have audience, very varied and rich audience segment data to start, we can run successful retargeting campaigns based on a very broad retargeting user group. It just means that campaign managers will be much more involved, and the learning process might take a little longer to get us to scale because we're not pre-training the models. So finally, audiences. So I started talking about audiences being the #1 pillar of retargeting campaign success. So I want to end on our final case study and actually talk about how segmenting your retargeting list into banded audiences can actually help you have a better and higher performing retargeting campaign. So as I mentioned, you could potentially be retargeting all users who you want to reactivate in your app, and some people might want to actually just focus on what we can consider your VIP users who were previously active and high spenders. There's challenges with both those approaches. If you're trying to reactivate everyone who's been active, you're potentially wasting effort on retargeting users who hadn't spent, and it's going to be much harder to convert a non-spender into a spender. If you're focusing only on your high value users, high spenders, you're potentially your volume, your potential to scale is going to be very low. These VIP users are often not going to be the majority of your audience. So, and there's a lot of valuable users who sort of sit between those two polar opposites. And this is where thinking about segmenting out your retargeting effort and identifying different user groups you'd like to retarget. And in this example, we're working with was segmenting your retargeting users into different spend levels. So highest historical spenders, users who have spent in various ranges. And what we didn't really do is we didn't focus on non-spenders. And by having these different segments, we were able to target these users and actually optimize against each user group separately. So that means for high-level spenders, we can be very aggressive we were much more aggressive in our bids. We were much more aggressive, in going after these users. We knew they were high value. And like before, their performance in terms of return on ad spend was very good, but scale wasn't there. However, so by also looking at the users who potentially were much larger in volume, but lower in typical spend, we also made efforts to acquire them. But we were doing so. We tried to do so as efficiently as possible, which meant we were reacquiring these users at much lower CPIs, but we were still driving a really large reactivation volume, and that allowed our campaign to balance both scale and performance, which if we were just running off, going after, VIP spenders, we would have never achieved the same scale. And if we were going off, just a general retargeting group with a lot of non-spenders, we would be potentially wasting, a lot of effort on trying to reactivate users who would never convert, and which would have led to a much less efficient campaign for our customer. When we do retargeting campaigns, audience is important, match rates, creative. We talked a lot about specifically with, with our experience in leveraging audience and creative for retargeting. So with that, I'm really excited to pass the presentation on to Martina, who will share more about Adjust Audience Builder product, which is one of the great partners for building audience segments for retargeting and other campaigns.
Hello, hi everyone. Thanks a lot, Nicole, for the nice intro. So I would like just to spend a couple of words for Adjust. We are a pretty young company founded back in 2012, and we are also fast growing. So we count over 190 employees spread across 14 global offices, and the main goal of Adjust is simplifying the mobile ecosystem. And by mobile ecosystem, I mean all engagement channels and third parties that are used by advertisers to run mobile campaigns. So in general, what we are doing is enabling marketers to measure, attribute, and analyze their mobile engagements. So the topic of today is segmentation. And in Adjust, when we talk about segmentation, we associate it to the audience builder, which is technically not an engagement tool, but it has a big influence when combined with those. This brings me to some benefits for applying segmentation. So when we're using Audience Builder, we would definitely reduce operational costs for clients and networks, and I explain why. So imagine you're an advertiser. I guess that most of you guys are advertisers listening, and when you need to provide a network with a CSV with some device IDs, you go to BI, you ask them to pull some logs raw data, based on raw data, and you ask them to for some metrics. This normally takes 1-2 days time if you are lucky. I mean, if you have enough BI resources, and then you have to send it to the ad network. They will have to upload these in their system and then run the campaigns. With the Audience Builder, you are able to, so the marketer itself, so the marketer becomes the BI, because they can start using the platform to create their own segmentations. They don't have to pull raw data, they have just to create some conditions and then provide the network with a URL, and the network will be able to download all these CSVs, the CSV file up to date, real time. And so this will save a lot of time and resources, and plus will give you fresh data. Also, What does it mean, share data only on need-to-know basis? It means that you can share, you can decide what to share. You can define the conditions and share it only with the partners that you want, that will run the campaigns. And in general, just by applying a very granular segmentation, you will definitely notice an overall increase of your conversion rate. So when it comes to user segmentation, we generally identify 4 broad scenarios, which would be cross-promo and retargeting, push campaigns, and lookalike. So cross-promo is when an advertiser has different applications in their portfolio, right? So you, for example, for gaming apps, it's normal that advertisers have more than 10. So if you're launching a new application and want to distribute it across some already existing user in one of your games, you can definitely do that. You can just pull all existing users of the old app and target them with the advertising of the new application. Then retargeting, you can create segments based on the behavior and preferences of the users, and this goes hand in hand with the push campaigns, where you can reach your user at the right time with the right content. For lookalikes, this is great because this is a great connection that we have with Facebook. We can share the data that we want, so not all data. We can share everything we want with Facebook, and we can create a very granular audience, custom audiences and lookalikes for a better user acquisition. So let's give a look to some cases that we took from our clients that are already using the audience builder. The first case would be creating exclusion lists. So that's definitely, you don't want to waste your money retargeting users that are already active. So all you do is just downloading, creating an audience and targeting all your active users, and just asking your partners not to target them. The second one would be dormant VIP users. Who are VIP users? So are users who have spent over an amount of revenue in the last period of time, depending on your business model, and haven't been active for a defined time. All you have to do is just defining which was their last session. You can define which is the revenue and define the install time, and here we go. Then intention to purchase. So, all users that have shown some interest to an intention to purchase, but they never really ended up doing it. So they started a payment and never finished. They added something to the cart, but never purchased, or have been viewing an item for more than once. Here we can define also this kind of audience, inactive users. In this case, for the conditions, as you can see, we excluded the users that registered, for instance. You can apply any conditions that you want, but definitely inactive users is always defined depending on your business model. This would be the last example is user who like promotions. I think all of us, but if you are an advertiser and you are tracking when a user, so you have a specific event that tells you when a user is redeeming a voucher code, then you can include it in your conditions. So you know that that user is often or only purchasing when they have some incentives, so you can retarget them with some incentives or some other vouchers. All right, just to sum up, I'm trying to speed up a little bit. So the main features of the audience builder are the following. First of all, you can create dynamic segments that are real-time. That's a very important concept. So there is no this exchange of data back and forth that takes up to 2-3 days, 1 week. You create the segment, you share it with your partner, and that's it. Also, every audience can be split up to 10 segments. This means that you create an audience, you can divide it in equal parts, up to 10 segments, and you can run A/B testing. So you can provide a network with 2 of these segments and ask them to run different type of campaigns. Same thing you can do with push notifications. So you can just pull push tokens for you and run 2 different types of push campaigns. Also, very, very important, as I mentioned before, segments are always deduct. So you don't have, every segment has different device IDs. It never happens that that networks are targeting the same device IDs. This is also the whole concept of the audience builder, because we want to avoid that networks are bidding against each other, so they lose money and also advertisers are spending extra money. In general, the advertiser and the networks have straight access to push tokens and device IDs. So on a click, you can simply download it from the dashboard. And in general, you have a full control over your data. This means, as I mentioned even before, you really know what and with whom your data is shared. And it's also pretty important, if you're using the audience builder, it's also important that you are working a bit on your tracking concept, because all data from audience builder, we have some default conditions, but the most important conditions will be based on your tracking concept, so on the events, on the in-app events that you are creating. And this is a very, very quick tutorial of how to create an audience. It's going to be crazy quick. So you just select the audience builder page, and on the top left, you will create a new audience. You can name it. You can decide which kind of operative system you want. You can define the ID type. So as I said, the device ID, advertising ID, or push token. And then you can define some conditions. You will select the application of your portfolio, because you might have more than one, and then start getting crazy with the conditions. So the first ones that you see, trackers, event, countries, device types, are all default sent that we provide, and then you can also define the revenue if you want. Last session, in this case, we wanted all users that spent more than $50 revenue, and at a session less of 1 week ago. We also wanted to include one event. In this case, it's add to cart. So after we define this audience, we just click on done. And here we have 2 groups. We can decide, in this case, we just decided to create 2 groups, but as I mentioned, you can create up to 10. You can rename the group, and you can also define the percentage of the groups if you want. And this is an example of a created audience. We decided to call it a low-hanging fruit and rename the links of this is clearly an A/B test. It's a 10% discount and free shipping. Probably we're targeting users that love purchasing with vouchers, and platform is iTunes. We want advertiser IDs, and then you see all the conditions. My presentation is almost over. I wanted to mention one thing. So I know that most of you are gaming companies, but we have a case that is pretty interesting for us. It's about Runtastic. I think you know the company. So Runtastic have been using the audience builder for the last month, and this is an interesting case regarding Facebook. So what they were doing before and what they're doing now. So before, they were using the Facebook module, as you all guys know, just by sharing data through the API. The thing is that the data shared with from Adjust were not being granular enough. So the algorithm of the segmentation was was the Facebook one. So it was granular, it was working definitely, but it was not so granular. And with very granular, I mean that after they started using the audience builder, they were managing to apply the condition for the one that you see, less active session within 14 days. And also the app activity should have been longer than 1 minute. So you can actually target users that were interested into your product. And this brings to some, so these are the final results. So with the extra segmentation achieved through the audience builder, Runtastic was able to target their VIP users much more effectively, as seen with a drastic improvement of RTP, means registration to purchase, when compared. So you see here there are two campaigns. You see the registration to purchase increased massively in the after the use of audience builder, and additionally you see a positive return on ad spend after just 7 days compared to the benchmark campaign where it took a longer period of time. So I'm done with my presentation. I will hand over it to Fabi for a Q&A session. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you so much, Martina, for the in-depth strategies around retargeting. I know there's still plenty of questions that you guys have. We have unfortunately limited time left, but let's see what we can cover. So how we're going to play it is that I received some questions from you guys, and I'm just going to ask them, basically alternating to Nicole and Martina. So the first question I have was for Nicole, and it was, what can Aarki do to increase / scale the reactivation numbers?
Sure. Okay, that's actually a good question. So I think this I'll expand a little bit upon this when that I think I covered in the presentation. So if you want to increase, so you have to think about what the goal of your campaign is. I'm gonna take this with that you probably have that if someone has a specific goal where you're looking to reactivate users and there's a specific return on ad spend goal, or if you're looking to reactivate users and let's say you want them to perform some sort of action. Probably I would say the most important thing you would do is to clean up your retargeting list, to remove any users who you have a very, will not or have a very low probability of ever meeting that goal of yours. So removing non-spenders, if people have historically not spent, they're not going to spend. If people have, not historically, done certain actions within your app, it's going to be much harder to convert them. So I would say, while it seems like you're actually making your retargeting audience smaller, in terms, you would actually be increasing the effectiveness of it, because your partners would not be, wasting impressions, resources on trying to get these users to take an action that historically they've not shown a propensity to do. So I would say that's probably one of the most things. So we would work with you to clean that out. Now, one thing we could do is if you don't have data, is we could we could definitely help you with that. One thing we can do at Aarki actually is if you are unsure of how to build these segments and identify them, at Aarki we do have tools. We could leverage data from from Adjust and other partners, or we have tools internally where we could use your your app events if you share them with us through, say, attribution from Adjust, where we can help you segment out these users if you are unsure of the best way of going about it.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I think that was pretty clear. So I hope that question was answered satisfactorily. The next one we have was for Adjust and Martina. So the first question actually is two parts to this. When dividing your user lists in groups, do they have to be equally separate?
Right. Yes, you can define the percentage for every segment. So if you have an audience with 3 groups, you can define 50% for one, 30% for one other, and the third one would have 20%. So yes, you definitely can.
Great. And the second part of the question was, is it possible to include users that have certain apps but don't have others? So for example, like in the case of Runtastic, where they try to run such a campaign. So maybe you can go a bit more into detail how that will work.
Okay. What I would do is downloading a CSV of all active users for one app and download another CSV for all active users of the other one, do a VLOOKUP, and then provide the remaining advertiser IDs to the network for targeting those ones. So yes, you can definitely do that.
Great. Thanks, Martina, for those detailed answers. I have one last question, which I'll ask to Nicole. And then for everybody who has asked questions, I'll, of course, forward them to Nicole and Martina to look at them after the webinar, because we're unfortunately a bit short of time. And for those who have lunch break, I want you to have a timely lunch break. So the question for Nicole would be, and maybe this is actually a good summary of the webinar in general, what are the most important retargeting segments maybe to go for when you're just starting out? If we were to run a campaign?
Actually, I think, yeah, this actually ties a little bit into what the last question. So I think as we touched upon, and as Martina touched upon, you know, one important thing is definitely identify your VIP users. You know, and then identify users who you want to sort of take out of your retargeting segment. Where is important. Now, I think probably some of the examples I gave were very black and white, where you have high spenders and non-spenders. If let's say you and it was very focused on things like purchases, for example. But you know, if let's say you're looking to have, let's say you want to have you're looking to reactivate users and have them try, say, a new feature in your app, or do something you know, that's new in the app, or maybe that they haven't leveraged before. Another thing you can actually do with your audience list is look for sort of markers for performance, sort of proxies, where you have a general, you know, within your app, you might know that there are certain activities that users do, where if they've done these activities, they're more likely to do other things. So if they, you know, it could be if they connect socially, they're more likely to, spend more time in game, or do certain types of challenges. If they, if they have certain behavior, it tends to lead to other behavior. So in cases where, so the other thing you can actually do, I think would be important, is let's say you have something that's new and you want to drive people back to, is to think about segmenting your audience in terms of actions users have taken. That will be a good marker for those types of users then completing another action in the past. I think that's not clear. So I know basically all my examples were very much around reactivating users and getting them to spend. But in terms of getting users to complete actions, sometimes that are particularly new within your app, think about you can still do retargeting campaigns in those cases. But you might not necessarily have users in that segment. So in that case, I would say what would be important is to then, in those scenarios, identify actions that you can then group into audience segments that you feel would lead to that action, and you can segment those. So it could be users who have reached a certain level. You think that they have, they could be like your they have a 10% chance of, potentially doing this action that you'd like them to do. Users who have reached a certain level and have then taken another action have a much higher percentage, and that could be a retargeting band too. Users who have reached a high level, have so many sessions per day, they could be your very high likelihood reactivation contenders. And so, I think the most important thing is that, identify these segments, identify key goals for each of them, and really, and don't feel that, even though the examples are very heavily focused on revenue events, that you're limited in running retargeting campaigns only for those types of scenarios, only for the types of scenarios where you have, where you're looking at banded spend data. There's lots of other types of retargeting campaigns that we can run.
Perfect, Nicole. Thanks so much for all the details. And well, with that, I would say that we wrap it up for today. I think it was a great discourse, great examples that you guys shared. Hopefully some inspiration and advice for everybody who's either just starting out or trying to refine their retargeting efforts on mobile. So as mentioned before, I'll send out the slides as well as the recording to everybody who was on the call, so you can look at it again if you want to, forward it in the team. And here just a little update that we'll be doing a webinar with Google. That's on the 5th of December. It's the last one for this year. But yeah, make sure to go to the Adjust website. We'll probably also send it to you via email so you can register and register your colleagues as well. But with that, I wanted to thank again Nicole for her presentation and being present on the webinar. And of course, Martina from the Adjust side also for your insights into how the audience builder works and giving you some examples of what you could segment in your own database. So yeah, that was it. Thanks so much for joining, and yeah, see you next time. Thanks.